All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Eric Poole with ICG, and this is another in our weekly series of webinars, and it's titled Campaigning and Communicating in a COVID World. And in preparation for this, I pulled an article from Florida Politico that was dated March 12th of 2020. And it's interesting from a couple of perspectives, but primarily from a time perspective. And the title is Coronavirus Imperiling Traditional Political Campaigning. And the article starts out and says, or asks, will the new coronavirus outbreak dramatically change election campaigning as we know it? And so this is almost 4 months ago, and it begins to address some of the presidential Democratic candidates who are beginning to cancel some of their campaign stops across the country. There is references to our current president who was scheduled to speak at certain private sector events, and those were being canceled. And so it's interesting at that time because the article points out that at that time, again, this is March 12th, not March 20th. And it said that nationally at that time, the number of COVID-19 cases had topped at 1,000 with 30 deaths. And in Florida, the number had jumped to just 23 cases. So that's interesting because the Department of Health this morning reported just for Tuesday, 10,181 new cases and a total of 301,810 total cases. Now, I'm not here to speak to whether or not the virus is spreading and increased testing. I think it's a little bit of both. But what it shows to me is that there was 4 months ago just concern about how you communicate to the public, and if you're running for office, how are you going to campaign? It's a lot different. And just a couple of numbers out there that we track, particularly Becky Berenstain in our office tracks, is that there were 219 commissioners and constitutional officers who were reelected without opposition. Now there are still 201 that are still running for election, and 116 of those are county commissioners. So this is an important time for you as a county commissioner if you're running for office, and how you communicate to your constituents during this period. And so to help us understand that, we have with us John Sowinski. He is a founding partner of Consensus Communications. They do a lot of work for the Association of Counties and the League of Cities. And in particular, I'd just like to point out in some of John's work, you're going to relate to some of these victories, including in 1992, the 80s Enough term limits, the 1994 net ban campaign, the 1994 No Casinos campaign, the 2000 campaign in support of high rail, the 2002 smoke-free workplace initiative, and one that we hold near and dear is the 2010 vote number 4 on 4 campaign. That was the hometown democracy amendment that would have really curtailed and limited local government's ability to amend their comprehensive plans. So I think with that as background, I'm going to turn it over to John, and he is an expert in the field, and let us know what he is seeing as a person that works in this area, and any advice that you can provide some of our members. So with that, I'm going to minimize my screen to save some of the bandwidth. And if anyone has any questions, there's a chat feature at the bottom along with a Q&A. You can just send those across, and at the end, we will present those to John. So John, thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you, Eric. I just want to make sure that everybody sees the first title screen of that. Have I shared my screen properly here?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you all for being here today. We're talking a little bit about campaigning and communicating in a COVID world, and we'll speak about how things have changed and how things remain the same. And I think surprisingly, there are an awful lot of things campaign-wise that remain the same, although logistically, there's certainly some challenges that are unique to this election cycle, hopefully, and unique to anything that we've seen before in the past. And really, before I go into the nuts and bolts of the campaigning and communicating part, I want to put up some slides that just are indicative of the national mood, because no campaign occurs in a vacuum. Campaigns happen and they're largely influenced, particularly influenced by things and attitudes that are more relevant to those issues and discussions that are going on in the races that are further up the ballot from the presidential campaign on down. And y'all are familiar with kind of the first question that's asked out of the box. And one of the things I'll say about this PowerPoint slideshow is that I have pulled together some data from various surveys that have been done about COVID and about some of the other topical issues of the day, from national and public sources here. In so much as Florida's a good bellwether for America, you know, we could say that this, you know, this would be indicative of opinions in Florida in all likelihood. I also apologize that the PowerPoint's not very pretty, because I have grabbed things from a number of different sources and mashed them up into this part of it. But the first question that comes on any survey is right direction, wrong track of the country. And as we see here, this June survey shows that it's almost 2-to-1 wrong track. Now, interestingly, typically what we see when we do a survey is when we do follow-up questions and ask about in the state, in your community, is that the numbers in communities tend to be much higher, unless there's some things really going on within that community that are challenges beyond that. And so this is kind of a bad attitude, you know, indicator of the public when it comes to the goings on in the country, if you will. One of the things that's very interesting when we talk about national mood, and one of the survey questions that we like to do in the early on in surveys, is we call it the issue matrix, and it's open-ended. And we ask people, what are the most 1 or 2 important issues or important challenges to you that government ought to address? And it's interesting. I'm going to show you this. This survey was done in June. It was the most recent public survey I could find. I would guess that if we took one in July, it would look more like the April numbers here, given the spike that we have in Florida going on. But as you can see, and the reason I put this up is that, and again, these are open-ended questions that are then coded by responses. The point of this slide is that as overwhelming issues of the day grab a larger share, as they did in April, for example, of the public's attention and concern, other things go down. So for example, in June, you know, June 20th, a little over a month ago, we had not seen much of the spike that we're currently experiencing here. And as you can see, concerns about coronavirus were going down. And as that happens, the beaker for social issues went up to 30. So, and what I would suspect, again, is if we took this survey again today, is that coronavirus would peak, and there would be things like reducing climate change that would go down a bit. Education is a mixed bag, because because there's this whole other separate discussion of when and how to return to school and everything else. But again, as issues like the economy and coronavirus drive people's concerns, then discussions about some of these other issues become less important to voters at that time. I'm going to go through this real quickly. Almost half of Americans see the national unemployment rate as a serious problem, and 37% somewhat serious. And so when you combine those, like 83% see unemployment as a problem, either somewhat or very serious. At the local level, that actually drops to 24% very serious and 34% somewhat serious. When we ask people, what about your local economy? And so there's a kind of a recognition in some communities that, you know, the things here are probably better than folks are facing in other parts of the country. 36% of households had at least one member lose employment. The 36% of Americans believe that we're in a major economic depression. 54% believe that this is a short-term recession. Now, what's interesting is these numbers are reversed from the Great Recession, the onset of the Great Recession. Back then, it was over 50% thought we were in a major economic depression, whereas 36% thought we were in a short-term recession. 57% of Floridians believe the state of the economy is bad. But even with these issues, a plurality of Americans prefer limited government to new programs and services, because there was a question in a national survey in June that was done, because there is a lot of talk about a more vigorous and robust government agenda beyond coronavirus and that sort of thing. And so what this tells us is that we kind of view economic issues and role of government. They want government to respond and handle issues as they come up. They want to make sure that but there's not a heavy mood for significantly expanding the scope of government and government services. The public polling has worsened in recent weeks. Concerns at an all-time high. These are related to COVID now, switching from the economy to COVID. 65% of Americans think that the coronavirus is getting worse. 60% are very concerned about the situation. 60% think it's being poorly handled, and 78% are concerned that they themselves will contract COVID. One of the things that we always see on issues, there are certain issues that everybody will nod their head for and agree that, yeah, that's an important issue and we ought to do something about that. When folks really care and there's really intensity about it is when they think it will affect them personally. Usually we're talking about economic issues where it affects them in the pocketbook personally. This is one where 78% see themselves as potential victims of this disease. And so it has a high level of relevance, obviously. Only 40% think President Trump's done a good job handling the pandemic, and 54% say the federal government did not go far enough. And that's trended upwards, that number. 48% of Americans worry their state has opened too quickly. And again, sort of concerns about the handling of the matter get, the level of concern is lower, meaning the level of approval is higher, the closer you get to people locally. There's not the kind of dramatic differences that we see on some issues, but it is significant how many people, and I know just kind of myself personally, as I sit home and watch the news, I have more confidence in what's going on in Tallahassee than in Washington, and I'm a lot more confident about what's going on in my local community than I am in Tallahassee. And based on the data, that would be a prevailing attitude, I think, as it relates to COVID. In COVID regarding states, 44% of Americans worry about the availability of local medical resources. 39% still worry about the scale of their local testing capacity. There's a lot of articles and a lot of issues related to testing and how long it's taken and can it be trusted with. And we've kind of gone from a world in COVID where during the first phase, very few of us personally knew someone who had contracted the disease or tested positive. We might have been separated, most people, by 1 or 2 degrees from someone who had been. Now most everyone knows somebody who's been affected, has a family member or coworker who's had it, and so again, it's become relevant. 65% of Americans give their governor, regardless of the state, higher marks in handling the issue than they give the president. 31%, again, this is across America, not specific to Florida, say their state opened too fast. And that number is trending upwards in the polls, as in subsequent polls that are being done. While only 30% believe Trump usually gets the health facts right, 64% trust the CDC and state health agencies. 50% trust their governors and local media outlets. This is an interesting, almost one of those, y'all know the old saying, hate Congress, love your Congress person, so to speak. This is similar to where folks, I think, single out Trump in this as opposed to the rest of the federal government. And part of that is that there are public departures that are made. Even yesterday, there was national news about, how some of the medical experts feel one way and others within the administration feel the other. Very high level of confidence in CDC and state health agencies. And what that says is that if you're taking actions as in local government that's based on CDC recommendations, 2/3 of the people are going to say, yeah, that's using sound judgment to go along with their with their suggested protocols. 65% of Floridians believe the state's efforts are going badly. This is a Florida-specific poll done by CBS. And 68% believe Florida's early reopening was because of federal pressure. Only 32% think it was a good idea. Again, these are findings of a CBS poll that were done on that. Now, I've got a couple of pieces of polling data. I'm going to switch to a completely different unadvertised topic here, but it's worth talking about because it is the other thing that's really affecting the national mood, which translates to politics all the way down, and especially in this case at the local level, because it deals with the issue of police reform. And what's interesting about this, the first set of tables at the top came from a McLaughlin and Associates nationally published poll that was done in June, done in mid to late June, on defunding the police. And by the way, that term means different things to different people. Some people think that means eliminating police forces. Those who say it usually say it means we'll redirect a large portion of police funding to other things. But the way the question was asked was simply, do you think the defunding of local police is a good idea or a bad idea? And the overall numbers were just basically 2-to-1 bad idea. 30% saying good idea, 57% saying bad idea. Now, among Democrats and Republicans, this was very interesting to me because we live in a world where usually what Democrats think is the polar opposite of what Republicans think. We are that fractured, that sort of politically tribal in our politics, unfortunately. And so normally, I mean, for example, during the virus, probably about a month before the reopenings started, I remember seeing a national poll that asked, would you be comfortable eating in a restaurant or not? With social distancing or whatever. It was like 74% of Republicans saying yes, 9% saying no. And Democrats was like 9% yes, 73 no. So normally on these sorts of issues that are big, emotionally driven, and even ideologically driven issues of the day, we see the polling data being exact opposite. We don't on this. Okay, so the good idea, Republicans, it's 2-to-1, 31, 62. There's a definite difference in how Democrats weigh in on this issue. 37% good idea, 43 bad idea. But the fact that you have them both in the plurality to majority world saying it's a bad idea. And what's interesting is the Democrats don't go to saying good idea. By and large, they go to refusing to answer the question, okay, and the survey. And so I would submit that some of those would probably, if they were forced to answer the question, that the numbers would get even closer together among Democrats and Republicans. You do have some trends among age and ethnic groups, okay, that are there. The African Americans are the one constituency that are good idea, plurality, bad idea. But even then, it's not overwhelming, okay? And you do have a big undecided on that. If you look at older versus younger voters, so under 55, it's a tie score. But over 55, there is absolutely no constituency for it, okay? So it's 77% bad idea, 10% saying good idea in age. Now, that being said, just about everybody, Republicans and Democrats alike, support very specific policing reforms of use by officers and report these incidents. Well, that's like 100% almost. You don't get that big a number on any question hardly in a poll that's done today. Requiring police to give verbal warning before shooting at a civilian. That gets, again, huge numbers across partisan and ideological spectrum. Requiring states to publicly release disciplinary records of law enforcement officers. Again, majorities of, regardless of party affiliation, allowing individuals to sue police officers. Republicans start to get close to going the other way on that, but even a majority there. They're the banning no-knock warrants. Democrats support, independent support by a slim majority, Republicans oppose. And so as you can see, the general defund the police thing doesn't get a strong following, but some specific police reform certainly does. The other thing I'd mention during and while all of this is going on is that a lot of folks would say, well, certainly we're going to see, some differences in terms of media consumption habits. And that's important when communicating or campaigning. And certainly there were some. And it's probably a little less dramatic than I would have guessed, because I feel like, I'm doing more on the internet and social media and that kind of thing. And but Facebook's first quarter data in the early, basically they got an early social media boost on that most users are spending more time online, about 10% more time in March on Facebook than they normally did. And so what this would suggest is that, Facebook becomes even a more important medium potentially in campaigns. By early May, 51% of adults were reporting increased time spent on social media during the lockdown. Adults are expected to spend 4 more minutes on messaging services and 7 more minutes on social media daily due to the pandemic. Okay. And this feels like an understatement, but these are actually significant numbers when you look at how people allocate their time across media. The one thing that was pretty interesting was that in media buyers that we rely on when we're doing big races that involve television and everything else, is what they're seeing in the COVID world is increased use of streaming services. They call it connected TV, streaming services in living rooms. Now, what that means is that some people rely on them a lot on their smartphone or their iPad or whatever, but when they go home, they're still looking at DirecTV or their local cable provider or whatever. But that what has happened with COVID is that there's been an accelerated use of connected services, cord cutting and going on with those. Now, here's why this is all important and why I give you all of this background on attitudes of these various issues. Is everybody probably remembers this triangle. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And hearkening back to the slide that had all of those issues and how when people move and when something overwhelms the day, in this case, COVID and the economy, two things, it removes people's level of concern about other issues that were top tier. I don't hear much about climate change these days, just for the record. And I did. Usually, a strong economy is the environmental movement's best friend, because the public has a lot more appetite for and affinity for funding those things, or having more aggressive regulatory or whatever when the economy is good, when they're not worried that might crash the economy or close a plant or whatever the case may be. But when we get in a world where the economy is king in terms of people's concerns, or when you have a major health dilemma like this, other issues sort of get crowded out of the space. And because we're down here, what I would suggest is that when the economy's good, everybody's needs and self-actualization are where people are. But when the economy's bad, or where there's an imminent threat to health, sort of the physical needs, the survival needs, as my psychology teacher referred to it, survival needs and safety needs are king at this point. And so towards the bottom of the pyramid is what people care about now. And now, one of the things that's also important, not just in COVID, but in modern America, is that they've actually altered Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or actually I have anyway. And that is to say that, more important than anything is strong Wi-Fi. And again, I say that as a bit of a joke and levity, but a lot of the working from home that's going on, that becomes even more important. Now we're going to get to the campaign stuff, and this will be pretty quick as we go through this. Is that I had a mentor who had done a lot of U.S. Senate and governor's races and been involved in presidential races. He's passed away a couple of years ago, but was fortunate to cross paths in the late 90s and early 2000s and benefit from some of his wisdom. And there were a couple of things he said that always made sense to me, and that is that every campaign, regardless of how big or how small that campaign is, does 7 things. It does research. It does special groups. This is, the building allies and coalition members. It does grassroots, which is kind of a geographic organizing of the ground game in politics. It does earned media. It does paid media. It does finance, raising money. And it does scheduling. That no matter how big or how small, and we've done U.S. Senate races and statewide ballot issues, and we've done local races as well, and these are how we organize the campaigns around these things. The other thing that he told us was that no matter what they invent, and at that time the internet was a fairly new deal, and there wasn't much video streaming or anything else, but that no matter what they invent, there's 2 different kinds of media out there. There's voluntary media and involuntary media. Involuntary media are those things that the voter has to make some effort in order to consume. They have to voluntarily to it. A piece of direct mail, a newspaper ad, internet display ads, written digital content, click-through content. Those are examples of voluntary media. Examples of involuntary media is TV. TV is the ultimate, very powerful involuntary media. You just wanted to watch the evening news, but all of a sudden you've gotten, a message beamed in between your eyeballs from the ads that are coming at you. Radio is a great involuntary media, especially drive time radio. Internet pre-roll. These are the video ads that you have to watch, in order to see the YouTube video you wanted to see, or in order to see the news piece that you clicked on to see. Usually 15 seconds, sometimes shorter. Graphic digital content. And what that means is something you don't have to read a lot of. It's just kind of like a billboard, basically. And that's where I put signs with light copy. Obviously, the sign, you have to read it and digest it. It becomes voluntary. But if it's just a name and a logo and you're driving down the road, involuntary media. Okay, so one of the things that, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but the more cluttered the environment, the more cluttered the political environment, the more important involuntary media becomes, because people aren't volunteering to consume tons of information on political races, typically. There may be some that they're very interested in for one reason or another, or they may be an extraordinarily conscientious voter that's going to really research, get out their sample ballot and talk to friends and go on websites and read articles or whatever. And y'all remember what 2016 was like. It was crazy in terms of the noise level from the presidential campaign. In a presidential cycle in Florida, there's tons of groups from across the country, and I guess we found out around the world, that want to affect our vote on the presidential race. And so it makes for a very noisy environment. Now, we don't have any US Senate races in Florida this year, so that actually sort of makes it a bit of a, a bit of a lighter environment. Basically, I always tell people when you're running a campaign, it's though you're in choppy waters on a boat and you're trying to leave wake behind. And the choppier the water, the harder it is to leave a wake behind. And so I don't expect this to be like 2016 because we don't have a barn burner U.S. Senate race going on, but it will be excruciatingly loud related to the presidential race. And so involuntary media becomes more important. I'm going to go one by one through these 7 things and just talk about the similarities and differences, and that'll go pretty quick. And then we'll go to Q&A. On research, polling, we're finding people to be more cooperative. They don't have anything better to do. They like to talk to someone, especially if you throw in a couple of questions about COVID in a survey in the beginning. People like to talk about it. We're having a slightly more challenging time getting people to do internet interviews. And I think people are just getting bombarded with content and the internet that might have some of those refusal rates but going on. But on balance, research is a little bit easier because the hardest part these days is the phone interviews. Special groups, coalitions and allies and getting endorsements, things like that. Face-to-face engagement, as you all know, is very, very difficult these days. There's more interaction by Zoom. The meetings like we're doing right now have become a phenomena even of local races because people don't want to be in the same room, particularly in the large urban areas that are there. There's more of a need for written communications to these groups, and written communications and follow-up and back and forth through emails, where it used to be able to be handled by just stopping by someone's office or giving a speech at a club or whatever the case may be. And what we've been suggesting is sort of online video gatherings. The Facebook platform has excellent ability to do these sorts of things that have social media benefits along with Zoom and some of the other ones. Grassroots, the geographic thing, door to door is still a thing. It's a little surprising. I had somebody knock on our door not long ago. They had some literature. They handed it to me. They stepped back 10 paces and it was comfortable having a discussion with them. Signs are obviously still a thing. People requesting signs through websites and Facebook and whatever the case may be. Facebook is not just media for getting message out. It is also an excellent grassroots organizing tool. And so it kind of covers a couple of these dots, if you will, that are there. And so Facebook strategy is sort of doubly important. Masks, obviously, if you got volunteers at doorsteps, they should, be armed with those. You just don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, but door knocking is still a thing. Earned media. COVID, the first thing that I said when COVID hit was that this might be the thing that really pushes a lot of the teetering newspapers to the brink. And we're seeing it happen now. Newspapers are stretched thin. They have fewer reporters. What that means for campaigns is having to prepare more and package more for them. Usually the news media responds to events, not facts, and precipitating events, and it's harder to create events in this sort of environment. And so that is the real challenge, is to create news hooks without having face-to-face events. And so that's the challenge for earned media that's there, but especially with reporters stretched thin, is that you need strong news hooks for things that you're going to be doing. The next thing is paid media. And as I talked about, there are these voluntary and involuntary forms. Most of these things are sort of unchanged, if you will. TV, by the way, might be a little cheaper than it normally would be. Even before COVID, we were being quoted lower rates this cycle than last cycle by TV buyers, because no cabinet races, no governor's race, no Senate races. It's just the presidential race and kind of everything else, if you will. Same with radio. It'll be a little bit less expensive than usual. Internet pre-roll is something that you can target to the person. And so that always makes sense. Graphic digital content is important. Things that they get, just they get the image, they get the candidate. It's sort of like a sign, if you will. Direct mail is unchanged. By the way, how to pay for all these things, and we'll get to that later, is what's changed a lot. How to fundraise, but internet display ads, written digital content, most of these things are reasonably unchanged in terms of the tactics for a campaign. But probably the biggest difference, as I said, for campaigning is how to raise money. And campaign events and fundraising events, we've always said, just create a deadline for people to bring their checks. Okay, there's lots of people that want to contribute, that promise to contribute to a candidate. They want to come to an event where they get a chance to see and say hi to that candidate. And so they often wait until there's an event in order to do that. And so what needs to happen in order to create that deadline without having face-to-face events is online events, or, and everybody doesn't like to hear this, or a lot more person-to-person calling by the candidate to the donor to secure the contributions, because it's harder to get people together en masse. So it might be whereas you normally have one big fundraising event, that you have multiple smaller Zoom type events with members of a finance committee that lead each night, that are responsible for each event, be it a day one or a night one or whatever the case may be. Scheduling, ironically, this actually creates some opportunities to better leverage candidate time. There's not the demands of large in-person events that there were before, and so it leaves more time for some of the things that we've talked about. You have to build discipline around the schedule, and we always say with candidates, we like to allocate their days across some of these 7 boxes. Finance ought to be a driver, earned media ought to be a driver, reaching out to special groups ought to be a driver, is to have some structure to better leverage the candidate's time during this period. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
John, thank you. Actually, there's not any questions. And I know we've got elected officials that are on the Zoom, and including former state elected officials. But I do got a question that maybe you can help us understand. And I think you answered a little bit in part in terms of voluntary versus involuntary media. But given that there is so much information and noise on the pandemic, what's being done, the economy at a national level, and then you have that same type of information being addressed at the state level. But you said earlier that based on polling that citizens typically trust the government that's closest to them. So you go from the federal government to the state and then to the local commissioners. So based on all this kind of noise that's coming through that they get to see on a daily basis by flipping on the channel, and they see their national news, and then they see their local news, and they get their local paper, how does an elected official who's running again try to pierce through all of that noise to get their message across about what's happening in their community and what their priorities are and what they're doing to serve them?
Sometimes what it takes is we've done some ads that we would call a pivot, where we say, these are extraordinary times in which we live, but even during extraordinary times, it's important that we do this, 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 and this. So part of it is an acknowledgement of the times that we're living in. Now, if it's TV, you've got 30 seconds, so you don't, which we always say is about 70 words. So you don't want to allocate a huge amount of time to that, but you want to recognize what's going on and the historic nature of what's going on, and then pivot to those other issues. But what I'm suggesting also is that the issues that candidates talk about will be driven by and large by voter attitudes about things. And so the economy, it's likely that even in local races, the economy is something that that commission candidates might need to talk about more. By the way, the local issue, growth management. You know, if there's one thing that really sits in the basket of stuff that local governments do, it's growth management. And we have seen in these times, and I've not done polling specific to this, but at those moments when there's a serious negative inflection on the economy, is that you have folks saying, well, let's not manage growth. Let's see if we can get some more construction jobs going on, like right now, like sooner. And so I think one of the things is to kind of recognize that attitudes toward certain other local issues are affected by the preeminence of the economic concern and the COVID concern that's out there. And the other thing is just creativity. A lot of folks will want to write a direct mail piece that has a position paper in it, basically, on something. And the best direct mail person I've ever worked with in my life said, "John, we're just trying to get people's attention between the mailbox and the garbage can." And I've got another person that I deal with a lot that says there's three kinds of people in the world: the kind of people that look at pictures, the kind of people that look at pictures and read the headlines, and the kind of people that read the whole article and they see the pictures and the headlines too. And that you've got to have something for everyone, if you will. Not every piece of mail has to be for everyone, but a lot of times I would leave the thicker content on the website and give a web link to it and hit the highlights. And I'm always taken back to, because everyone's very proud of their trade and their craft. And this is a person who's nationally recognized, being one of the best direct mail people. "John, we're just trying to get people's attention between the mailbox and the trash can."
Great. Well, actually, John, sticking with the theme of media, we do get a question that came across, and it asks, is there a superior social media format for campaigning? Again, in your opinion, Facebook versus Instagram, Twitter, et cetera.
The Facebook is king still. And a lot of that has to do with generationally, that's where folks who are chronic voters kind of hang out. The age demographic of voters overlays nicely with Facebook. The Instagram, if you've got a particularly young district or younger constituency, it trends towards Instagram. Twitter is really for opinion leaders and for just sort of political geeks and news. That's how you communicate with the media now. I remember when the blast press release came out, the fax blast that we do, and boy, we were proud when we had whatever the program was loaded up and you could send out 100 faxes, and that's how we would do press releases. Then it became emails. Now it's tweets. We tweet reporters. And so Twitter is for talking to sort of the political chattering class, if you will, and reporters. Facebook is for talking to just about everybody who fits the voting demographic. Instagram is younger. Now, the other thing that Facebook has going on is that they're a lot less restrictive in their policies in terms of how they treat the privacy of our information. They're a lot less restrictive. And so the targeting capability is pretty amazing. You can have an audience of people who are your followers, and in Facebook, they have what are called lookalike audiences. And so you can go and set the geographic boundaries, and their lookalike algorithm is scary in terms of how effective it is. We've used it in statewide campaigns and attracted followers and everything else using Facebook. So Facebook is to answer the question, Facebook was kind of built for this, welcomes it, and is populated by, folks who are, in a voting age group, that they're chronic voters.
So you said earlier that when there's a lot of noise, and we anticipate a lot of noise in the fall, that the best type of media is the involuntary media, right? So kind of extending that and looking at your example of Maslow's hierarchy. And so the economy is bad, people are concerned, so everyone's kind of down at the bottom of that pyramid now. They're worried about, initially everyone was hoarding toilet paper. They weren't going to the gym. That was their priority. So given that, if everyone is sort of sitting down here and that part of the hierarchy, how does that fit in terms of the communication? Is it the formal? Is it the informal media type stuff?
It's a little harder to be flippant and cute. I remember, and I don't know if you all remember seeing this ad, and it might have been 2 or 3 election cycles, and I can't remember her name, but she's a woman, Republican, who was elected to the United States Senate, I believe in Iowa, somewhere in the Midwest. And she had ads because grew up on a farm, and she had ads about how part of what she did was castrate cattle or whatever and with the tone that she's going to go to Washington and, you know, do some castration up there too of government and of this and of that. That type of levity probably doesn't play as well right now. You know, on one hand, it might be refreshing. On the other hand, it's risky, you know. And so typically, I think we're at a time mood-wise where serious times, you know, require sort of serious people, if you will. And there's a lot of, I'm a Republican, so I can be critical. I think a lot of folks, you know, look at, you know, sort of some of the things the president has said and done this. Well, let's just not being a serious person here. You know, we need to be serious people. And so regardless of partisan stripes, I think people are looking for a degree of seriousness, which limits the creativity a little bit of ads. And so I just think ads need to fit. In order to break through, they need to fit the moment, but they need to stand out. They need to do something. And we always say that a really good ad has a leave behind, has a payoff moment, something that's a twist at the end that people will remember, and that they will say or do. We've got, and I always don't, I mean, a lot of times car dealer ads are not particularly well produced ads, and we had one where, and it was not a client of ours. We don't do any of that type of advertising, but there was a David Moss was a auto dealer in the Orlando area, and he would end every one of his ads with the 2 thumbs up, you know, that kind of made it him. That was his imprimatur that he had. And I didn't know him, but his attorney told me, he's like, oh yeah, people walk up to him on the street and they do this, and they, you know, they'll come to the dealership and and so I'm not saying you need to come up with a hand signal or anything like that, but just a leave behind. We did Katherine Harris's race for Secretary of State, and there was one thing where she was talking about her efforts to, you know, for beach preservation in Florida, and it was one of those, come on, I'll show you. And the come on, I'll show you was something that people really remembered and caught on with you. So you have to have some creativity, but I would say I would say you know, the example that I gave, the castrating cattle, probably not a good ad right now.
Someone suggested that it might have been Joni Ernst. I don't know if that's the name.
I think that's right. I think that's right. Yes. It was a great ad, by the way, and fit the time and everything else. It might would be a little off right now. I don't think her consultant would make that ad right now.
John, we don't have any more questions, which doesn't mean people aren't interested in what you had to say today. I certainly enjoyed your presentation, and we appreciate everything that Consensus does and has done in the past. So we appreciate your partnership, and thank you for coming on today.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.